Sawadee-kap. Hello and welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha. Today we're in our Pali Canon and English study group, which happens on Saturday at 9 p.m. Thai time, and whatever time it is across the world, wherever you are, every Saturday we study the Buddha's teachings from the Pali Canon in English. This is the words of the Buddha as that were documented after he died, and he taught for 45 years. So they ended up writing down his teachings after he died. And today we have these teachings in English, and students who've been studying with me either online or in person using this book, Developing a Life Practice, The Path That Leads to Nibbana, they ultimately kind of graduate or kind of move into this Pali Canon English study group. Some students will actually study in this program on Sunday and Wednesday using this book, where we learn in the group learning program week by week on Sunday and Wednesday. So some will do the same program, that group learning program, and the Pali Canon and English program together, but some students will just kind of move into this program on Saturday, where we're using this series of 13 books that are the words of the Buddha and exclusively his words. So all throughout the world, students have been reading chapters in these books in order to study the words of the Buddha. And then we use this time to come together as a community to first do meditation together. And then after our meditation, we will move into accepting any questions from anybody who's been studying in these books throughout this week. So if you're joining us for the first time, you're welcome to stick around for the meditation. You're even welcome to stick around to learn from these books, because I'll be displaying this book on the screen and you'll be able to see exactly what we're talking about and what we're discussing in this Pali Canon and English study group. Tomorrow, which is Sunday, we're going to be in chapter 4 of this book, Developing a Life Practice, The Path That Leads to Nibbana. And in that chapter is the 3 universal truths and the 4 noble truths. By learning that on Sunday, which is tomorrow at this exact same time, that's really the beginning of the path to enlightenment. So if you've ever been interested, even the smallest little interest of Gotama Buddha's teachings, that would be a great class for you to attend, because it's really the starting point of where Gotama Buddha started when he first attained enlightenment and started teaching. This was his very first discourse, helping his students to learn and understand the 4 noble truths. And as I often share, is there's nothing in Gotama Buddha's teachings that are based on belief. The more you learn his teachings, you reflect on them and practice them, you can see that they're true, and you can gain wisdom on this path to help awaken the mind to be more and more enlightened, where the mind will be peaceful, calm, serene, and content with joy permanently. It never experiences any discontentedness whatsoever. So there's never any anger, frustration, irritation, annoyance, guilt, shame, fear, boredom, loneliness, shyness, resentment, jealousy. The enlightened mind never experiences this anymore. All of those discontent feelings have been eradicated through training the mind on this path to enlightenment. And meditation is an important part of this path, but it's not the only part. So we start our classes here with meditation to help prepare the mind and clear out anything that the mind might be thinking about or holding on to. But then we actually move into studying the actual words of the Buddha. And this meditation that we do ahead of time kind of prepares the mind to receive the teachings. It's kind of a great way to just kind of clear out the mind. But people who are really firmly on this path and really dedicated to developing their mind to enlightenment, they would be meditating 2 or 3 times a day for about 30 minutes or more each session. And we use breathing mindfulness meditation in order to train the mind to eliminate craving, desire, attachment. In fact, the book that we're studying, this book Ānāpānasati, is all the Buddha's words, the most, not all of them, but the most important teachings that he shared around meditation. And there's a team of people who extracted out of these large 45 volumes of books, they extracted the Buddhist teachings related to meditation and they put them in this small little book that is easily digestible. Now, I've referenced a few books here today, and in this particular set, there's actually 13 books, and this particular book, it's over 300 pages long, but all of these books are available at no cost. I provide a mechanism where you can actually download these books in PDF format, and you're able to download them right to your hard drive and start learning and reading directly with the Buddhist teachings. And not only do you have the reading, but you have the audiobooks, you have the videos, the podcasts, the quizzes, personal guidance, and all of these other ways to receive guidance with an actual teacher. So if you are not yet in our Facebook group as a member, you can become a member. Everyone's approved. You can get access to these resources where they're all available at no cost. And if you would like printed copies, they're available through Amazon, or these I'm actually shipping out to people from Thailand. But in a matter of probably 6 months or so, I'm actually going to have these in Amazon as well, with some updated translations for everybody to be able to learn with. So lots coming out in terms of making the teachings more and more and more accessible to the Western world, because being here in Thailand, specifically in Chiang Mai, Thailand, I have access to teachings that other people don't necessarily have access to in the Western world, because, you know, the way that we're kind of brought up in Western culture is that there's kind of like the Bible, if we've, you know, been Christian, and there's just one little book and pretty much everybody's got it and you can get it really easily. But the Buddhist teachings are assembled in 45 large volumes of books, and they're not really easily accessible, and not everybody really knows where to go to actually get access to the teachings. But here in Thailand, there's places that cultivate these teachings and really ensure that they stay in a good state and they're preserved over many generations. And I've been very fortunate to be able to get access to these teachings at a place here in Thailand that has curated these teachings into these small digestible books that you might consider like the cliff notes of the Buddhist teachings. And I have these available if anybody would like them, either in PDF format, you can download them, or in printed format. So with all that said, so that you know what our plan is for today, let's go ahead and start with our breathing mindfulness meditation. And then when we're done, we'll come back into the classroom and actually give you guys a chance to ask any questions that you have related to the teachings in this book, Ānāpānasati. So thank you for joining. And I'd like to just invite you to pull up a meditation cushion or a chair, or if you'd like to do lying meditation or seated meditation or standing meditation. We're going to be doing breathing mindfulness meditation where you're focused on the breath in order to help clear the mind and bring it into the present moment, eliminating craving, desire, and attachment. So your lower body should be nice and comfortable, but not luxurious. If you're in a chair, that means your feet are probably flat on the floor or crossed at the ankles. If you're sitting on the floor, you might put some cushions under your rear to get your rear up in the air and lessen that angle at the hips and the knees and the ankles. Your upper body should be erect, where your spine, the muscles around the spine are actually engaged. This helps to keep the mind attentive and alert during your meditation, because if you slouch or you're kind of lean back, the mind has a tendency to turn off and become disengaged. So by keeping your spine erect during meditation, it helps to keep the mind active and attentive so you can actively train the mind during meditation. Your hands and arms, there's lots of different options there. Gotama Buddha placed his right hand over his left with his thumbs together and then placed that in his lap. But if that's not comfortable for some reason, you can put your palms on your thighs, on your knees. You can put your arms on the armrest. Totally up to you. The important thing is that your body is comfortable, but not luxurious. Now just close the eyes and start breathing in through the nose and out through the nose. nice, steady, consistent, natural breaths. Breathing in through the nose and out through the nose. Breathing in and out. Your breath can be at any pace. It doesn't necessarily need to sync up with the guidance that I'm giving. I'm just generally helping you to understand to breathe in and out. But you do that at your pace. Breathing in and out. Just work on establishing this nice natural breath, experiencing the full breath as you breathe in and out. I'm going to do some chanting just to kind of ease us into meditation, and then I'll come back with some very light guidance. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Mahakava Bhutang Mahakavantang Apiva Teami Savakato Mahakavata Tammo Damang Namasami Supatipano Mahakavato Savakasangho Sanghang Namami Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Iti piso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho Vicacaranang Sammuno Sakhato Rogavitu Anutero Purisa Dhammasati Satatava Manusanang Bhuto Bhagavati. Okay, you should be breathing in through the nose and out through the nose. I'll just give some light guidance here, because the people who usually join this class tend to be more developed in their meditation practice. It's our group learning program where we really start laying the foundation for these teachings. So you should be breathing in and out. Focus the mind on the breath. Fixate the mind on the sound of the breath or the sensation of air moving into the nose. This is the present moment. The mind can reside peaceful and calm when it's in the present moment. Breathing in and out. And breathing in and out. As the mind wanders to the past or to the future, if there's any thoughts, ideas, perceptions, just cut those off. Let them go. Focus the mind on the breath, the present moment. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. Focusing the mind on the breath, just letting go of anything that arises in the mind. You have nowhere to go. You have nothing to do. No one needs you right now. Just focus on the breath. สัมมาสัมพุทโธมหะวาพุทธังภะคะวันตังอะภิวาเทมิสวากขาโตมหะวตาธัมโมธัมมังนามัสสามิสุปฏิปันโนภะคะวะโตสาวกสังโฆสังฆังนามามินะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะอิติปิโสภะคะวะอะระหังสัมมาสัมพุทโธวิจาจารณังสัมมุโนสักขาโตโรกาวิโตอนุเตโรปุริสาธัมมาสติสัตตาตวามนุสนังพุทโธภควาติ Right, if you guys would like to slowly start coming out of your meditation, what we'll end up doing with the rest of our class time is just opening things up for any questions based on the reading of this book, chapters 17 through 32. Those are the last half of the book, and while that sounds like a lot of chapters, that probably would only take about 45 minutes to read, and maybe even shorter, because a lot of these chapters have some similarities to them in this book, because the Buddha is basically talking about kind of what he suggests for meditation. But I would like to turn things over to Bassam, who is our moderator for today. Manal is away doing some other things, and Bassam's going to be looking at Facebook and YouTube and in Zoom. If you have questions, just put them into the comment section, and then he'll be sure your question gets asked during the class. And then if you are in Zoom and you would like to ask your question directly, you can electronically raise the hand, and Bassam will call on you to allow you to ask any questions or follow-up questions you have directly based on the readings of this book. And if you don't have this book yet, go to our Facebook group, Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha, and in the menus, there's a files section, and you can go under files, and you can download this book using a link there, and you'll be able to get the PDF version of it. And if you'd like to print that, you can just go ahead and print it. It's not copyrighted. Or if you'd like versions of these printed books very nicely, you can go to our website, buddhadailywisdom.com, and from there you can go to the online classes, and at the very bottom of that there's a link to be able to purchase a full set of these books. So with that, I'll just turn things over to Bassam and any questions that any of you guys have related to the reading of this chapter 17 through 32.
Okay, thanks, teacher. The first question is coming from chapter 17. Judith asking, it talks about assisting people with suicide. And this month, we have a new law in Spain about euthanasia. People need to say just a few times that they want to die from whatever pain that might not even have been treated. And they then are euthanized. I don't understand some situations can really be torture. What would the Buddha say about that?
Yeah, so during the lifetime of the Buddha, there were, of course, people committing suicide, either in household environments or even amongst his disciples, his monks, his students were also sometimes committing suicide because in any particular population, there's going to be a certain number of people that are going to potentially be interested in committing suicide. But he talks about this in a couple of different ways. In his discussion about the Four Noble Truths, he talks about the craving for existence, how the mind craves existence in this world. And he also talks about craving for extermination, how the mind craves extinguishing and getting rid of this life. And he describes it as part of the problem with the unenlightened mind, that it's this craving, desire, attachment, this mental longing with a strong eagerness, either for existence or for extermination, that is part of the significant problem with the unenlightened mind. And what he teaches as part of his teachings is to be in the middle, where you don't take delight in pleasure in life, in existing, but you also aren't craving for extermination of life either. Because it's the pleasures, not that we can't enjoy life, but it's the mind longing for pleasure through the six senses that the mind is conditioned, its internal feelings, on these external situations. And if we allow the mind to crave for pleasant feelings through the six senses for pleasure, then you're also inviting in pain as well. Because when those conditions that are creating the pleasurable feelings don't exist, then the mind's going to experience painful feelings like sadness or anger, frustration, irritation, guilt, shame, fear, all of these other painful feelings. So that is part of the problem. And his students weren't all enlightened, right? Like there's certainly a large population of them that attained enlightenment during his lifetime, but a lot of people were just in the process of learning and practicing. So sometimes people's minds did all kinds of wacky things and they either committed suicide, or as you see here, there were some people that were asking for assistance to commit suicide during his lifetime. And I haven't seen anything specifically where he's talked about, don't commit suicide. If you do, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. But if you put together his teachings, you can see very clearly, I feel, what he would teach on this topic. First, in the five precepts, he talks about refraining from taking life without stick or sword, living compassionately, trembling for the welfare of all living beings. Well, if you're trembling for the welfare of all living beings and you have compassion, then you're not going to kill any other living beings, including this life, because this life is a living being. So if you were to kill yourself, you're essentially committing assisted suicide or death. You're causing death, which means there has to be a certain craving in the mind to cause your own death. Then he talks in other teachings where he talks about the fuel that causes rebirth is craving, desire, attachment. This craving, this mental longing with a strong eagerness is the fuel that causes rebirth. So for someone who kills themselves or opts for assisted suicide, or the fancy word that people are using is euthanasia, but let's not mistake it. What it is it's assisted suicide. this person still has craving. They have craving for extermination, and they're going to be reborn. And most likely, they are not going to be reborn back into the human realm. They're going to be reborn into one of the lower realms of either hell, animal realm, or afflicted spirits. And being reborn into one of those lower realms, it's like a prison. It's like being trapped. It's very difficult to get back to the human life. And anybody who's in a human life right now has already been countless beings in the past. So to be able to get to a human life, it's actually quite treasured. It's a very rare thing, and we should really treasure this life as a human being. And we shouldn't allow this human life to go to waste. Now, certainly, there's a lot of struggles and there's a lot of miseries that we face on this in this life. But once you get on the path to enlightenment and you start learning and you start understanding these natural laws of existence, you can remedy all of the struggles and all the misery, all the sorrow, all the displeasure. You can remedy all that through learning the natural laws and practicing the teachings. You know, it's a real struggle to live in a world that we don't understand. And someone who's contemplating suicide, from my experience, and I've actually in the past had suicidal thoughts as well, usually people don't want to die. They're not interested in dying. They just want to end the pain. They want to end the either physical pain or the mental pain. They don't really truly want to die. They just don't know of any other option other than to kill. And they may think that they're only getting one life, so therefore they think if they kill themselves that solves the problem. But in reality, it's actually making the problem worse, because the problem that they're having is the discontent mind. And they're having this problem of the cycle of rebirth, where they keep being reborn over and over and over again. Now that they're in a human life, this is the opportunity to actually solve the problem. By learning and practicing the teachings of the Buddha, you can solve the discontent mind, attain enlightenment, and thus end this whole cycle of rebirth, so that you end the misery once and for all, that you're never actually reborn. But by killing themselves, even with euthanasia, they're actually making the problem worse, because now they're going to be reborn into a lower realm. They're going to have to go through countless more rebirths before they ever get a chance to get back to the human realm again. And then it all starts over again. They're going to have to learn to walk and talk and chew food and do ABCs and math and interact in social situations. It all starts all over again. So they actually haven't solved the problem at all. They've actually made it worse, because now they're going to keep going through these countless rounds of rebirth. Even someone who's terminally ill, let's just say they're given 2 or 3 years to live, or 2 or 3 or 6 months to live, and the physical pain becomes so difficult that they feel that opting for assisted suicide is the better option for them, because they don't want to go through another year or 2 of pain, and they know they're going to die anyway. So why not just kill? Why not just kill themselves? Well, in this situation, their mind is not enlightened, we know, because they're craving extermination. And in order to be escaping this cycle of rebirth, they would need to extinguish all their craving. Well, if they go to kill themselves, they're just making the problem worse, like we talked about. And while they're not enlightened at that moment, because they're still craving extermination, they may actually attain enlightenment at death. They don't know. The better thing to do is, rather than kill yourself, is to actually go ahead and work on training the mind for the next year, 2 or 3, however long the doctors have said that you're actually going to live. And then you're going to improve the condition of your mind. And even if you don't attain enlightenment during life or at death, your next rebirth will be better. That actually solves the real problem. Or you might actually attain enlightenment at death, and then the whole cycle is done. Whereas if you actively kill yourself through suicide, you're actually making the problem a lot worse. And keep in mind that doctors, while they're often very wise and have a lot of knowledge, they're not always 100% right, because that would be permanence, right? There's certainly people that have been given 6 months to live, and 6 years later, they're still living. So it's important that when we hear things from doctors that we consider their advice, we consider their wisdom, but also understand that it might not be 100% true. In some regards, they are just kind of guessing, and it's an educated guess, but they're also somewhat guessing. So if I was told as an unenlightened being that I have 2 years to live and I'm in excruciating pain, rather than having craving to kill myself and exterminate life, I would instead focus those 2 years to train the mind, work to get to enlightenment, and improve any potential rebirth that you might have on a future life, or potentially attain enlightenment in those next 2 years or at death, and actually eliminate this misery once and for all, that there's no longer any rebirth. So that would be my suggestions based on everything that I know about the Buddhist teachings. I absolutely would not suggest anyone opt for euthanasia because they're just making the problem worse.
Okay, teacher. Next question is from chapter 20.
Okay, let's go to chapter 20. Here we go.
Yes, in the first paragraph, maybe last 2 lines from the first paragraph. The Buddha is saying, remain focused on the inconsistency of all untruth. This point or this teaching is not clear for me, so let's try to rephrase it in a different way. Is this give the same meaning if we say remain focused on the impermanence of all phenomena, or remain focused on the permanence of all natural laws? Does this give the same meaning?
In some ways, but I would suggest the way to reword this, if you're not comfortable with the wording here, is essentially what the Buddha is suggesting here is to stay focused on determining the truth. So look for the truth. Where I always talk about learning the teachings, independently observing those teachings to be truth in order to acquire wisdom. That's essentially what he's saying here. Is he's saying remain focused on the inconsistency of untruths. So by you seeing the inconsistency of untruths, then you're going to essentially know the truth. Because remember the environment that he was teaching in. There were Brahmin priests who had kind of like the lay people really believing that they had to come to them in order to pay money and pray to all these various gods, and that was what's going to make their life better. That was like a significant part of the population that were all giving money to a Brahmin priest in order to somehow pray on their behalf and make their life better. Then there were all these various camps of ascetics that had given up worldly possessions and were claiming that they had the teachings that lead to enlightenment. And there were all these various camps of people who were teaching various things. Some of them had some similarities to the Buddhist teachings, but in other cases they were very far away from the Buddhist teachings, kind of a mixed bag. And the Buddha knew that his teachings are what leads to enlightenment because he was experiencing it himself, and he knew that he had the truth. But the people that were studying with him and the people in his community, there were people that would come and go, right? Just because a student was maybe under study with him for a month or two doesn't mean that they were dedicated and confident in his teachings at that point. They might be learning from him in a couple of discourses, but then they go off and learn with somebody else as well. Or, some of those other students from other camps might actually come into his discourses and start learning with him as well. So one of the things that I feel that he's saying here is remain focused on the inconsistency of all untruths as a way of saying, hey, whatever you're learning, whatever you're understanding as part of this path, make sure you're always seeking the truth, because there's going to be inconsistencies. I know, this isn't the Buddha's words, but I know there would be inconsistency in those other teachers' teachings. That's why one of the reasons why they won't lead to enlightenment, because someone who's attained enlightenment, their teachings are very consistent and they very much sync up, and there's no conflict in the teachings. One part of the teachings is going to support and be in sync with another part of the teachings. But that's the Buddhist teachings. Another person's teachings is going to have inconsistencies because it's going to have untruths, and that's why their teachings don't lead to enlightenment, because their teachings have inconsistencies and untruths. So I feel that what this is essentially saying is look for the truth, focus on those inconsistencies that you're seeing, and make sure that you always pursue the wisdom by confirming it for yourself.
Yes, thanks, teacher. The next question is from chapter 22.
Okay.
In the first two lines, Judith is asking, here it's written, no shaking in the body, no shaking in the mind. So Judith is saying, does any state of the body prevent one from achieving enlightenment? And she continues saying, I don't mean drunk, I mean organic illness related.
Can you repeat that again, Bassem?
Yeah, sure, teacher. It's written in the first two lines, no shaking in the body, no shaking in the mind. So she asks, saying, does any state of the body prevent one from achieving enlightenment? And she continues saying, I don't mean drunk, I mean organic illness related.
Yeah, the only thing that would prevent somebody in terms of the physical body to attain enlightenment is if there was some kind of trauma to the brain where the mind is not functioning properly based on trauma to the brain. That's the only thing that would affect somebody's ability to intellectually learn the teachings, reflect on those teachings, and then practice the teachings. There's people with, either birth defects or trauma that happens after they're born that inhibits their ability to process and think through the mind. The brain and the mind are two different things, but if there's damage to the brain, it will affect the mind. So that's the only thing with the physical body that would be limiting in order for somebody to attain enlightenment during their lifetime. Now, that person could still attain enlightenment at death, but during their lifetime, they would have no ability to attain enlightenment because they don't have the ability to intellectually learn. And that's part of what sets all of this in motion, is to be able to gain and acquire wisdom to unravel the ignorance, which is the main hindrance to enlightenment. You would have to be able to intellectually learn, reflect, and practice the teachings. But what the Buddha is talking about in this chapter is he's essentially focusing on the mind. And what he's saying is that when there's no shaking and trembling in the mind, then the body won't shake and tremble either. Because one of the things that can happen as you're learning meditation and you're progressing on this path is there's people who in meditation, they have involuntary movements where their body will shake, and it's as the mind's unraveling. Because as you're training the mind and you're awakening to enlightenment, you're kind of unraveling this ball of twine in the mind, and these various experiences start to surface that are buried deep in the mind. And you can have involuntary movements of the body. I know of people that have been swaying or shaking. I had some of different movements as well as I was working very closely with this. But that only happens as the mind starts opening up and starts awakening. Once the mind becomes more fully awake and it's fully liberated, there will be no shaking in the body. There will be no trembling in the body during meditation. And even in daily life, there won't be any shaking or trembling because the mind is perfectly at rest, it's perfectly peaceful, and there's not going to be any shaking in the body. If there is shaking and trembling in the body, this is oftentimes from an overactive mind, and that's why as you're awakening and you're not yet fully enlightened, there can be shaking and trembling during meditation. But as you awaken more and more, the mind becomes so unshakable. It becomes so steady. It becomes like a pillar or a post driven deep into the ground. And because the mind is so stable, then you'll notice that the body will be stable too. This is why when you observe enlightened beings, they don't make very quick, rapid gestures with the body. Because in the unenlightened state, the mind is very reactive. And because the mind is very reactive, the body is also very reactive as well. It reacts very rapidly to any kind of thing that's going on because the mind is reacting that way. But once the mind is fully liberated and it's calm and it's steady and it's unshakable, one of the things you'll notice is that the movements of an enlightened being are very gradual because that's the way the mind is functioning. So because everything is being sourced from the mind, the movements of your body are going to be very steady and very stable as well. This is one of the things you can do as you're on this path to enlightenment is train the mind to really slow down, be very steady, very calm, and at the same time be sure that translates over to your bodily actions. This is also with the speech as well, that you'll notice someone who's unenlightened, they will speak very rapidly and very quick because the mind has overactivity, and everything that's going on in the mind is going to be seen in the body, either through bodily movements or through speech as well. And by slowing the mind down, you'll see the movements of the body will be softened, as well as the speech. It will be very steady, very consistent. It won't be rushed or hurried because an enlightened being's mind moves at a very steady, consistent pace. So that's why they will speak in a very steady and consistent way as well. So that's what he's referring to here by no shaking or trembling in the mind. There won't be any shaking or trembling in the body either.
Okay, Amina has a question. She says, the book refers a few times to the monks going out into the forest to meditate. In modern times, would the equivalent be joining a silent retreat or taking a vow of silence? Is there a benefit for a householder to take on this idea of isolation for a brief period of time?
I think isolation is very helpful. And how you decide to do that, whether you do it by going away to a cave somewhere or you go to a resort by yourself or something like that, I think it can be very, very, very helpful because, it helps you to see what the mind is still holding on to. Because when you're by yourself and completely secluded, you're going to be able to observe the mind because there's no stimulus around, and you're going to see, oh, I'm missing my daughter, or I'm missing my husband, or I'm missing my mobile phone, or I'm missing the internet connection, or I'm missing this certain type of food that I always enjoy to eat, or a certain type of sleeping arrangement. You'll see certain things that will arise in the mind at various times that will give you insight into what the mind is still attached to. So you can go into seclusion like this at different times throughout the year in order to observe the mind. And the Buddha actually did this all through his life. There were certain times where he would be teaching and he would just kind of go off for like 2 or 3 months and kind of leave everybody on their own. And, it wasn't like, okay, while I'm gone, this person's in charge. It was just like, goodbye, and he's gone. And, maybe not even saying goodbye as a way of maintaining his own practice. So these kind of things can be helpful, but I suggest that at the same time that you look for, kind of silent environments, that you also don't avoid environments like what I create in the retreats that I host, which the retreats I host are kind of a combination of both. They're more in the middle. They're not completely wide open, but they're not completely silent either. We have like 3 or 4 hours in the morning that are somewhat silent, and there's 3 or 4 hours in the evening that are somewhat silent. And then there's a couple of days here and there where we'll have like 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day that are somewhat silent. But throughout the rest of the retreat, we actually go out and do things in the community. Because remember, a major step on this path to enlightenment is right speech, where we have to train the mind how to speak, using those 5 factors of well-spoken speech. So if we're always silent, like if somebody would to be silent for like 10 years or 5 years, while they will get a lot of insight into the mind and be able to train the mind really, really well, there's also this lack of interaction with other humans, which means you're not going to be able to train right speech and a lot of the other aspects of this path. Whereas if you're secluded and isolated in this bubble in a cave, then you haven't really gone out into the world and trained the mind in an environment where it's interacting with various stimulus and various people. So you've got to make sure you balance what you're doing, that if you are going to go into seclusion for any period of time, that you always make sure that you're balancing that out with some interaction as well, in order to practice right speech, for example, and learn how to exist in the world with a peaceful, calm, serene, and content mind with joy. I think of these silent retreats and kind of going into a secluded environment like a petri dish. It's like a perfect environment, but that perfect environment isn't permanent. So oftentimes what I hear is people go away to these 10 or 15 or 20 or 30-day silent retreats, and everything's absolutely outstanding for them during that time because all the other meditators aren't talking, everyone's on their P's and Q's, it's a perfect kind of serene environment. But then within a matter of hours or days coming out of that environment, some people discuss how their practice falls apart because they didn't really have any transition from that kind of petri dish into the real world. So that's why I like to teach retreats in the way that I teach them, where it's kind of a mixture of both. Because I actually am interested in students getting that text message from their children or from their husband or wife and say, "Mommy, we miss you so much. You've been away at that retreat for 5 days and we miss you so much. When are you coming home?" Because that's going to produce certain feelings or not in your mind. And right there, you have the opportunity to interact with me as your teacher and say, "Hey, I got this text message from my daughter. I'm feeling really guilty that I've been away for 5 days and I've got another 5 more days to go. What are some teachings that can help me to deal with this?" And I'm interested in that happening rather than, 10 or 20 days of complete isolation and then wham, you're right back into your environment at home again and everything comes rushing back. I kind of like this middle way where there's some silence, but then there's some interaction as well. And you can kind of slowly integrate these teachings over the course of the retreat into various interactions that you're having in the community and over mobile phones and things like this. So yes, you can try silent retreats and things like this, but just be sure you understand to balance that out with some interaction and training the mind with things like right speech.
Okay, in the next chapter 23.
Okay.
Yes, in the first line or the title, the Buddha is saying the final in-breath and out-breath are known. Maybe this point is not clear enough. What does the Buddha mean by final breath?
Okay, I'll answer that question, but one thing I would like to point out for you guys is this name here, Rahula, this is the Buddha's son. So the Buddha is giving this teaching to his son. And I always like to point this out because there's this big myth in the world that the Buddha completely walked out on his family and never looked back. And some people even get angry at this and they think that that's bad or that's wrong, or, he was like a deadbeat dad or something like that. But in reality, he just left for 6 years and then he came back, and his son, his wife, his stepmother, his cousins, and a lot of people in his family ordained with him and were actually learning to attain enlightenment. So this is indication of that whenever you see a teaching being delivered to Rahula, this is the Buddha's son that he's talking to. And now, as we go through this teaching, when he's talking about being aware of the very last breath, what he's talking about there is death, is that having such awareness of breath that you're even aware of your very last in-breath and your very last out-breath. And here in Thailand, I've been around several different people that have died, and we were either I was in their presence or my wife was in their presence. And what I hear from people is that, at least on two different occasions, we've had family members that, as they were dying and the family was kind of looking over them, they took their very last, they were aware of it, you could see their eyes, and then, and they died in that instant. So the Buddha is explaining here that, being aware of the breath is so important, even the very last one, which I think is down here at the bottom, where he's talking about the final in-breath and final out-breath should be known, right, as they ceased. So be aware of your breath, even when you're on your deathbed and you know that death is imminent. Still be focusing on the in-breath and the out-breath, the in-breath and the out-breath. Because if you've attained enlightenment, you will already know that before your death. But if you haven't attained enlightenment, you may attain enlightenment at death, and just focusing on your in-breath and your out-breath, in-breath and out-breath. Just focus on the breath and the breathing in the present moment so that you're not craving anything, right? We all have to come to terms with, yes, we're all going to die. There's no way around that. So the Buddha is providing some guidance here of what to be doing at the time of your death, which is focusing on the in-breaths and the out-breaths. That's how important breathing mindfulness meditation is.
Okay, a comment on Facebook. Jacqueline says the sound is very low in Facebook. So maybe you can fix this.
Okay, let me see. Oh, yes, it looks like the microphone isn't working here. Let me see if I can get this working. Okay, Jacqueline, it should be working now. Thank you for letting me know that. If you can just confirm with Bassam that that's working, but it should be working now.
Yeah. Chapter 24 seems that this chapter has deep teachings. So can you kindly shed some light on this chapter?
Yes. So let's read through chapter 24, and then we can talk about it as we go. It's not very long. It's just a one-pager here. So I'll just read through it, okay? So chapter 24. One who perceives non-self eradicates the conceit I am. Okay? So this is somebody who realizes non-self, eradicates the conceit I am. We've talked about non-self in the group learning program and what that is. We've talked about conceit and what that is, right? Like arrogance and ego and pride. All of this is essentially the ego, non-self and conceit. The Buddha didn't have the word ego available to him during his lifetime, and he actually talked about it in two different pieces, one being non-self and one being conceit. It's us who have combined it into this word called ego. But if you actually look at it in two different pieces, the way the Buddha did, you actually be more successful at eradicating the ego, because there's two different parts to it that we talk about in the group learning program. When he talks about the conceit I am, think about how we talk about, maybe different times in our life, or you've heard people talk about where you're like, I am so wonderful. I am so great. I am a mother. I am a father. I am a construction worker. I am a airline hostess or whatever, right? This is the self. This is conceit. I am this. I am that. And the mind's going to be interested to hold on to this. And as long as the mind holds on to this self and it holds on to conceit, it's never going to experience enlightenment. It's never going to experience that peaceful, calm, serene, and content mind with joy, because it's always going to be defending and protecting this self, and it's always going to be projecting this arrogance or this pride. And whenever somebody kind of infringes on that, the mind's going to experience discontentedness. So right away with the title of this, we know that the Buddha is talking about the ego, what we call the ego. by the time he gets to the end of this. But he talks about some other stuff here too. When monks, a monk has wholesome friends, wholesome companions, wholesome comrades, it can be predicted of him that he will be virtuous. I included this part, practicing moral conduct, because that's what virtuous is, someone who's practicing moral conduct. One who resides restrained by the training guidelines, possessed of wholesome conduct in resort, seeing danger in small thoughts, having undertaken the training guidelines, will train in them. Okay, so here in this paragraph, he's talking about cultivating wholesome friends, companions, comrades, because if you have wholesome people around you, you're going to be more likely to practice virtuous conduct. Whereas if you're hanging around people that are into unwholesome things, you're going to potentially slip into those things too. Not that we're judging those people, not that we're looking down on them with any arrogance or anything like that, but if you've been involved in alcoholism or drug addiction or addiction to sex or gambling or any of these other things, if you're hanging around people that are still into that kind of stuff, your mind's going to have a tendency to slip into that. Whereas if you surround yourself with wholesome people that are into wholesome things, then you're going to have a tendency to practice moral conduct. That's what the Buddha's talking about here. Residing restrained, holding yourself back from the training guidelines. The training guidelines are his teachings. His teachings are training the mind to produce this wholesome conduct, which ultimately leads to enlightenment. And he adds here, seeing danger in the smallest thoughts. So if we just add that little bit of sarcasm to our speech, you need to see the danger in that, okay, maybe in the past you've been sarcastic and you've kind of pushed people's buttons here and there, but all that's going to do is create more problems for you. So you've got to see the danger in that you're working on extinguishing this unwholesome karma by making only wholesome decisions. So a practitioner who's moving closer and closer to right speech, they're going to see the danger in even the smallest little thoughts because they understand the teaching so well. They can see the danger in all these small little thoughts that they will aspire to not actually have those small thoughts. But if they do, they just put it in the past and move on and improve their conduct later. So having undertaken the training guidelines, will train in them. You'll apply dedication and commitment to training the mind. When a monk has wholesome friends, wholesome companions, wholesome comrades, it can be predicted of him that he will get to hear at will, without trouble or difficulty, talk concerned with the holy life that is conducive to opening up the heart. That is, talk on elimination of desires, on contentment, on solitude, on not getting bound up with others, on arousing energy, on virtuous behavior, on concentration, on wisdom, on liberation, on the wisdom and vision of liberation. So here, it's essentially what I was just talking about, is that when you're around wholesome people who essentially, are maybe on this path, and he's talking to the monks, of course, so he's talking about having the monks ensure that they're hanging out with other monks in ascetics, essentially, and not getting bound up with people who are into unwholesome things, because by doing so, there's going to be discussions amongst these 10 monks about the teachings that the Buddha delivered. Because the Buddha would deliver these big talks about every 7 to 8 days, but then all the other times he was going around being invited from household to household or village to village, and he would give little talks throughout the week, but then he would always have these big talks, every 7 to 8 days. And when he wasn't giving these big talks, he was going around teaching other people, but his monks and people in his community would be gathered around talking and discussing the teachings outside of the presence of the Buddha. And this was one of the ways that they learned and practiced the teachings. is by talking amongst themselves, so that the next time that they're with the Buddha, then they could kind of consult him and say, hey, we were talking about this aspect of your teachings, and we would like to get some clarification on this, right? So if you're around wholesome people who are into the path to enlightenment, or even just into other wholesome things, you're going to have talk and discussion about things that are going to be helpful in your life. When you see this opening up of the heart, the Thai people oftentimes think of the mind as being in the heart, right? We in the West tend to point to the head, and people in other cultures consider the mind to kind of be outside the body even. Where the mind is exactly, I would say that we don't know, because the mind is intangible. It's not a physical thing that you can touch, and we don't really know where the mind is. And we actually don't really need to know where the mind is, because no matter where it is, we still need to train it. We still need to train it to be peaceful, calm, serene, content with joy, and eliminate this discontentedness. But what I feel that the Buddha is actually referring to here is, I'm not sure if it was during his time or not, but definitely the Thai people often point to the heart when they talk about the mind. So I have a feeling that the Buddha might have considered that the mind is inside the heart, and that's what he's actually talking about here, is opening up the mind. But I'm not sure 100% on that, but I have enough evidence to kind of think that that's probably what he's actually talking about, is opening up the mind, not necessarily the heart itself, literally. So let's go on to the next paragraph. When a monk has wholesome friends, wholesome companions, wholesome comrades, it can be predicted of him that he will arouse energy for abandoning unwholesome qualities and acquiring wholesome qualities. He is strong, firm in effort, not casting off the duty of cultivating wholesome qualities. Well, if you were going to encapsulate the path to enlightenment in one sentence, that's actually it in terms of what are you really doing on this path. What you're really doing is you're eliminating unwholesome qualities from the mind, and you're cultivating wholesome qualities in the mind. And in order to do this, it's a lot of work. There's a whole path that the Buddha lays out for us to help us understand how to do that, but it's a lot of work. And as you see here, he talks about being strong, firm in effort, not casting off the duty. In other words, don't procrastinate. Don't become complacent, thinking that you don't need to cultivate these wholesome qualities, because it's a lot of work to cultivate these wholesome qualities. But the beauty is that once you eradicate all these fetters, once you eradicate these taints or these defilements or this pollution of the mind, and you eradicate it and you bring in these wholesome qualities, while that's a lot of effort to do, once you do it and the work's done, the work's done. Those unwholesome qualities are never going to come back into the mind. The enlightened mind is permanent. So while you have a lot of work ahead of you in order to eliminate these unwholesome qualities and arise these wholesome qualities, once you do so, it becomes effortless to practice these wholesome qualities. But it does take a lot of effort to get there. And as you practice this path more and more, it actually becomes easier and easier as you put things together and you start noticing how these things work together. But, if you're a couple of weeks into this, or a couple of months, or even a year or two into this, there's going to be times where it's really, really difficult and it's really hard. You're working with a lot of problems, you're rolling up the sleeves, and you're really struggling. And that's where you really need to reach out to your teacher and get help. But then there's other times where it's a little bit easier and it's a little bit lighter and things are kind of a little bit smoother. Don't forget to, during those times where things are a little bit smooth, is to maintain your practice. Don't feel like, I haven't had discontentedness for 3 months, I'm going to just stop meditating. No, that's casting off the duty of cultivating these wholesome qualities. You have to stay strong and firm in your effort, dedicated, diligent to applying these teachings all the way through your life. And as you do, the mind becomes more and more awakened, and this path is like first nature. that it becomes effortless at a certain point, and you no longer have to put in as much effort as you maybe once did. But don't slack off and just continue to stay consistent with learning and practicing all the way through your life. This next paragraph: when a monk has wholesome friends, wholesome companions, wholesome comrades, it can be predicted of him that he will be wise, possessing the wisdom that discerns arising and passing away, which is noble and penetrative and leads to the complete destruction of discontentedness. So here, once again, talking about good friends, wholesome friends, that he will possess the wisdom that discerns arising and passing away. This is basically the wisdom of the universal truth of impermanence. For someone who has wisdom that discerns arising, something that rises is going to pass away, that means you understand impermanence. If you understand and have the wisdom of arising and passing away, anything that arises is going to have to pass away. Anything that arises is going to have to cease to exist. It's not permanent. So that's why our physical bodies are going to die, because they arise from birth and then they pass away. The anger that arises in the mind, it's then going to pass away. Or if you've arisen a career in a job, eventually that's going to pass away. Your relationships in your life, you have certain relationships that arise and they're going to pass away. That's all impermanent, right? So once you understand impermanence, now he says, which is noble, meaning because all these various people, he was teaching to the essentially working class people, because the Brahmins were considered to be the upper class, the 15% upper class. The lower 85% of the population were like the lower class of this caste system, and they thought that you kind of had to be reborn into a particular caste in order to be noble. But the Buddha reframed what people thought of as noble and what they thought of as being desirable in terms of being a good person. He always described having this wisdom on this path to enlightenment as being noble, because he was encouraging these lower class people, or these working class people, these middle class people, that, hey, you know, while you may have this desire and craving to be a royal, or to be in the royal family, or be rich or famous, or, you know, something like this, you can actually be noble by learning and practicing these teachings and gaining this wisdom. So he's recasting people's understanding of what it means to be a noble person, or a part of the royal family. Not literally part of the royal family, but noble and wise by learning and practicing these teachings. And this wisdom penetrating into the mind and permeating in the mind leads to the complete destruction of discontentedness. It's the wisdom that eradicates this ignorance, this unknowing of true reality. That's the main hindrance that's hindering the unenlightened mind from attaining enlightenment, is the ignorance, the unknowing of true reality. And it's this penetrative wisdom that leads to the complete destruction of discontentedness, because the more the mind awakens to this wisdom, it will make better and better decisions in the world, and you will start noticing that the discontentedness will slowly, gradually decrease over time. So now he says, having based himself on these 5 things, the 5 things that we just talked about, all those paragraphs, the monk should develop further another 4 things. Okay? These 4 things that he's talking about are his 4 meditations, his prescriptions for meditations. 1 is the perception of unattractiveness of the body should be developed to abandon lust. This is sensual desire, or having the craving for sexual contact. If somebody has a lot of partners and they're trying to bring their sexual cravings down to a minimum, there's a meditation to develop the unattractiveness of the body, to abandon lust. And ultimately, if you're working to get to that third or fourth stage of enlightenment, where you extinguish sexual contact altogether, then you may need to work with this meditation to completely abandon sexual contact 100%, when or if you decide to actually get to that point. So that's one meditation. The second one that he's talking about here is loving kindness should be developed to abandon ill will, right? Ill will is that second poison. The first poison, or the first unwholesome root in the mind, is craving, desire, attachment, which that first meditation there is helping with that. But now this second meditation of loving kindness should be developed to abandon ill will. That's that second poison, or that second unwholesome root of anger, hatred, ill will. And practicing loving kindness meditation and developing that in the mind is going to help to eradicate this from the mind in meditation, but then also practicing loving kindness in daily life. Then the third one is mindfulness of breathing, or what I call breathing mindfulness meditation, should be developed to cut off thoughts, right? This is where I talked last week on Saturday, where I said the Buddha's teachings, where he's talking about contemplating the body, tranquilizing the mental formations, all of these things, these aren't literal things that he's actually saying that you should be doing necessarily in meditation. What breathing mindfulness meditation is all about is encapsulated in this one sentence right here. Now, there's a lot of other things that you need to learn in order to do breathing mindfulness meditation, which I guide you in and I've taught you guys. But this is why when the mind wanders in meditation, you train the mind to let go or cut off thoughts. You're not eliminating the thoughts. You're training the mind to let go of the thoughts and focus back on the breath. And you might be back on the breath for 10 seconds or 2 or 3 minutes, and the mind wanders again, right? Cut that off and bring it back. You're not going to probably eliminate that wandering. You're going to essentially always have some amount of the mind moving off the breath, but you're going to catch it sooner and sooner and sooner and sooner, that you train the mind to let go, let go, let go. And where this becomes beneficial is in daily life. When things happen and you see a certain situation, you feel the arising anger or hatred or ill will, or you have frustration or guilt or shame or boredom or loneliness or jealousy or resentment. When you see that and you have awareness of mind that these feelings are starting to arise, you cut it off and you let it go in your daily life. But you're only going to be able to be good at that and do that really proficiently if you've trained in meditation, doing breathing mindfulness meditation over a very long, consistent period of time. Because in breathing mindfulness meditation, you're developing awareness of mind to be aware of the thoughts. And then when you're aware of the thoughts and you notice you're not on the breath, you cut that off and focus back on the breath. And by doing that over repeated sessions in daily life, it's going to become easier and easier and easier. You're going to catch it sooner and sooner and sooner. And when you cut it off, you eventually get to the point where the arising unwholesome thoughts never arise. The Buddha talks about this as obliterating the unwholesome thoughts, leaving it like a palm stump, like the stump of a palm tree. So if you're catching it sooner and sooner and sooner, it's like cutting back the branches, coming back to the trunk, cutting it all the way down to the stump, where eventually the tree no longer grows again because you've cut it back so far. Well, when you develop this awareness of mind through those 4 foundations of mindfulness, of the body, the feelings, the mind, and the mental formations or the mental objects, then you're cutting it back sooner and sooner and sooner, because the mind has developed awareness of mind to get back sooner and sooner and sooner, and you're cutting it off sooner and sooner. I talk about this like meditation is having a bucket and you're scooping water into your bucket. Nice, clear, clean water is coming into your bucket, and you're filling up this bucket of water because the mind is very thirsty, right? And you're cultivating this water in your meditation practice and developing this clearer and clearer bucket of water. Well, as you're going throughout your day, there's going to be various things that happen, and it's almost like somebody's kind of trying to sneak up and put poison into your water. I mean, you're doing it yourself, but it's like someone trying to put poison into your water. Well, if you notice that the poison's coming, you can slap a lid on that bucket and not allow the poison to go into the bucket. If you can do that, if you can catch the arising feelings of anger, or frustration, or guilt, or shame, if you can catch that when it's just bodily sensations and you can cut it off there, that's like slapping the lid on your bucket and keeping your water nice and pure. Because once the poison gets into the water, it's really hard to get it out. So once the anger comes into the mind and now it becomes feelings, it starts changing the condition of the mind. And it's a lot harder to get it out. And that's why you might deal with it for a few hours or a few days or a few weeks over one particular incident. But if you can cut it back sooner and sooner and sooner, and you can see that poison coming, and you can slap a lid on your bucket, and you just notice the bodily sensations, you can cut it off there. And eventually, when you get really good at that, through cutting off the thoughts, then eventually these thoughts don't ever arise. This is where an enlightened person will never experience the arising of anger, ever. They will never experience guilt or shame or fear. They will never experience boredom or loneliness or shyness or jealousy or resentment, because they've cut off the craving so much that they've obliterated it, where the arising discontentedness never arises. And breathing mindfulness meditation is where you do that, and you train in that, but then you do it in daily life as you notice these arising thoughts. And then the fourth one is the perception of impermanence should be developed to eradicate the conceit I am. When one perceives impermanence, the perception of non-self is stabilized. One who perceives non-self eradicates the conceit I am, which is nibbana in this very life. So this perception of impermanence, you can develop this in meditation, but you can also develop it outside of meditation. You can walk around in daily life and just observe how everything is impermanent. Walking on the sidewalk, it looks nice, and then there's a crack. That's impermanence. You notice that your car's bright and shiny, and now it's got scratches on it. Impermanence. Your clothes, you pick up your clothes and you see a string, or you see the buttons falling off. That's impermanence. You see your hair, every time you have to cut your hair. Impermanence, impermanence, impermanence. It keeps growing, it keeps growing, you keep cutting it, and it's impermanent. It just keeps growing over and over again, and you have to keep cutting it, and it's a different length every time. Your body, at one time you might have been thin or slender, and now you have gained some extra weight, or you've got extra weight and now you're thin. There's all these different ways that you can perceive impermanence outside of meditation. But if you need to, in meditation, for a period of time, not always, but maybe just for a period of time, as you feel and experience thoughts arising, notice how they're impermanent. Or if you feel bodily sensations in the body arise, don't scratch them. Just stay focused on the breath, but notice how those bodily sensations are impermanent. They will arise, and then they will cease to exist. This is soaking impermanence into the mind. The Buddha said the perception of impermanence should be developed to eradicate the conceit I am. What I say is soak impermanence into the mind. And when you start to understand that everything is impermanent, then to eradicate the conceit I am and stabilize this non-self that he's talking about, essentially the problem with non-self is, or the problem with the mind not understanding non-self, is if you ask the mind, where is Jacqueline, or where is Marcia, or where is Amina, or where is Alan? Essentially, most people will probably point to the physical body. and they'll say, that's the self, or that's Alan, this is David, right? Well, this can't be David. This can't be permanently David because this physical body is impermanent. So the mind, the problem is that the unenlightened mind is falsely identifying with this physical body or this mind, perhaps both, and considering that this is the self. This is David. This physical body is David. But the more you develop and soak in this perception of impermanence in the mind, then the mind starts to slowly understand that this body can't be David. It can't be permanently David because this body is impermanent. And the more that you get in touch with that through disassociating with this physical body as being David, then you start distancing the mind from this conceit or this arrogance of I am. And whenever you notice the conceits or the arrogance arise, cut that off. Or wherever you notice that you're protecting the self-image or the self-identity, cut that off, eradicate it. And then the Buddha's last part here is he's talking about how this is nibbana in this very life, because two of the most challenging fetters for people to ultimately eliminate are typically the self, that personal existence view, and the conceit, the arrogance, the pride, we would say the ego. That's one of the very most challenging things to eradicate on this path, is to dissolve the ego. And it doesn't mean that it's going to absolutely be the last thing to go, but for a lot of people, it's, kind of like on the tail end of getting to enlightenment, is letting go of the self and letting go of the conceit I am. We talk about eliminating personal existence view as that first fetter and getting to that first stage of enlightenment, and it's significantly decreased. This conceit I am is significantly decreased when you let go of the self as part of that first fetter. But this eighth fetter, that's part of this upper fetters, this conceit, the full ego isn't fully dissolved until you eradicate both the personal existence view and conceit as part of the fetters. So these four things that the Buddha is talking about to develop are essentially 4 meditations, and then there are certain practices outside of meditation in order to kind of continue the benefits of this outside of meditation. These are the four meditations that I talk about in this book, Developing a Life Practice. So if you've been reading or you've been exploring this book, in chapter 11, there's 4 meditations that I share in there. These are the 4 that I share. And the more you develop them, the better. But you should do this with the guidance of a teacher. You can learn breathing mindfulness meditation and loving kindness and have that as a steady, consistent practice in your life, that pretty much everybody's going to need those 2 in order to attain enlightenment. These other 2, not everybody would necessarily absolutely need them, but in special circumstances, you're going to need these other meditations. And I usually work with people on a one-on-one basis to be able to implement those. I haven't really taught those as a class yet, but perhaps I should, teach those as a class. But these are the 4 meditations. You don't need to run out and learn 50 or 100 different meditations. These are the only 4 that you'll ever truly need. And out of these 4, you may only actually need 2. And the beauty in that is you get to really deepen your practice and really understand and cultivate this meditation really, really deeply, rather than spreading yourself thin and having to learn 50 or 100 different meditations. The Buddha made it very simple that it's only these 4, and it's really only 2 that you really need to deeply cultivate. And that way you can get a lot of benefit and results out of each one of these meditations, because you'll become very well versed in all of these if you end up needing all of them. But definitely number 2 and 3, loving kindness and breathing mindfulness meditation.
Thanks, teacher, for this clear and detailed explanation. Next question is from chapter 26.
Okay.
The Buddha is here talking about someone who has recovered from his illness just by hearing some perceptions, these 10 perceptions. So, can you clarify this point?
Yeah, all I really know about this story is what's captured here in the teachings. The Buddha, one of his main students, is going off to visit another monk, and the Buddha gives instructions to Ananda, which Ananda was his cousin, essentially like his brother, that was with him from the very beginning and was one of his closest students all the way through his whole 45 years of teaching. So he gave instructions to Ananda that, okay, this other monk is not well, he's got some illness or some sickness. While you go visit him, teach him these 10 perceptions, essentially. The perception of impermanence, non-self, unattractiveness of the body, which those are meditations that we were just talking about, essentially. Perception of danger, abandoning, freedom from strong feelings, elimination, non-delight in the entire world, impermanence of all conditioned mental objects, and mindfulness of breathing, teaching him meditation and ensuring that he knows all of these 10 things. And based on this teaching, the Buddha goes through each of these 10 perceptions, explaining exactly what they are. And what the teaching says is that when Ananda went and actually delivered these teachings to this monk, that by the time they were done and the monk understood all of these teachings, his illness had subsided. One of the things that I can share from experience is that a large number of the illnesses and sicknesses that we experience in the human world are due to stress and anguish in the mind. This is really well documented throughout scientific evidence that something like 90% of all visits to a general medical practitioner are stress related. Well, that stress is being produced by the individual. That stress is discontentedness. The more you understand the Buddha's teachings and you practice them, you liberate the mind from this stress, from this anguish, from this displeasure, from this discontentedness. You will see that the health of the body improves. This is where this is where the Buddha talks about tranquility of the body, that for someone who's attained enlightenment, the body is very light and very tranquil. You might remember times where you've come home from work or you've come home from being outside and your feet just feel so heavy and the body feels so heavy and the shoulders or the neck might feel so heavy. This is the burden that the Buddha talks about. He talks about carrying around the burden. Essentially, the burden that you're carrying around is you're carrying around craving, desire, attachment. That's the burden. But you're also carrying around this anger and this ignorance, this unknowing of true reality. When you eliminate craving, desire, attachment from the mind, you're laying down the burden of having to carry all this around. Because when you're carrying around craving, desire, attachment in the mind, it puts a real burden on the mind, and thus now there's a burden on the body. So the body becomes very heavy and very weighted to the point where you can just feel exhausted at the end of your day, like you've been carrying around tons of bricks or weights. So I can see how by Ananda sharing these teachings and somebody deeply understanding them, as their mind becomes more and more liberated, any kind of illness or sickness that the person was experiencing could be liberated from the body. It could become free because they're liberating the mind. And the more liberated the mind becomes, the more freedom you're going to feel in the body. The body's going to feel more light. And that's what I feel is being documented here in this teaching.
Okay, chapter 32,
Okay.
last chapter.
Sure. 28.
Yeah, a question from Nick. He says, the last chapter 32. Would you be so kind as to go over what is meant by all the different paragraphs that say they have not any regards to the deathless, and then they have with the deathless?
Okay. First, let's talk about what the deathless is, and let me find it in here.
Next page.
Is it down here?
Yeah, maybe last paragraph.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about what the deathless is. This is another way to refer to enlightenment, because remember that if somebody has, if you remember dependent origination from the second book, this was back quite a while ago, the Sotapanna book. In there is where we study dependent origination. And this is where the Buddha walks through 12 individual aspects of things that conditioned, and then the next thing comes to be. So with ignorance, volitional formations come to be. With volitional formations, consciousness, I think it is, or it goes through 12 different steps. And ultimately, what you get to at the end of this whole stream of dependent origination is you get to birth, aging, sickness, and death, essentially. So the Buddha's motivation to pursue this path to enlightenment and this journey that he went on to for 6 years to discover the enlightened teachings, to awaken the mind, it was motivated by him going outside his palace and observing sickness, aging, and death, and then the ascetic or the roaming monk who was trying to seek enlightenment. We call this the 4 observations. And these were the motivators, because he was about to become the king and he saw sickness, aging, and death in the kingdom, and he felt like he was essentially going to be ruling over misery, and he wasn't interested in doing that. He wanted to help the people escape this discontentedness, but he didn't understand why people were so discontent when there was sickness, aging, and death. He didn't understand it. So he went on this journey at the age of 29 to figure out, what is the cause of this sickness, aging, and death, and also what is the cause of this discontent mind that all these people in the kingdom are having during these particular periods. So the problem that he figured out is the craving, desire, attachment, and all the other teachings that he shared, which is essentially attaining this enlightened mental state where the mind no longer experiences discontentedness. But the real problem that he was really looking to solve is this whole cycle of rebirth, is unraveling that and trying to understand how to eliminate death, because that was such a significant problem for people. If you've been around anyone that's died, that's something that really shakes people up. So by eliminating ignorance, which is the beginning of that dependent origination, with wisdom being the antidote to ignorance or unknowing a true reality, you eliminate this causal relationship between these 12 individual things, which ultimately leads to birth, aging, and death. Well, if we can eliminate birth, then we can eliminate aging and death, because if a being is not born, then it's never going to experience sickness, aging, and death. So someone who has attained enlightenment, they are no longer ever going to be reborn ever again. So the Buddha referred to them in some cases as the deathless, that they're never essentially going to experience death again, because the mind has been trained so well that sure, at the end of this particular life that the mind is enlightened, the physical body is going to experience death, but the mind isn't going to necessarily experience death. So that's what he's referring to here when he's talking about the deathless, that this being who is enlightened can no longer experience death because the mind is no longer going to experience birth. It's never going to be reborn again. So that's what he's referring to here when he talks about the deathless. But let me go through each individual line. So he talks about mindfulness directed to the body. This is the one thing that, when developed and cultivated, leads to penetrative wisdom. Okay, so that wisdom is the key, right? Because that unlocks the ignorance. The ignorance is the problem that is the beginning of this dependent origination that leads to the whole 12-step causation that ultimately leads to birth. As long as there's ignorance in the mind that it hasn't attained enlightenment yet, there's going to be rebirth. So by eradicating the ignorance through penetrative wisdom, essentially permeating wisdom in the mind, then that essentially is what gets you to enlightenment. So mindfulness directed at the body, or this breathing mindfulness meditation, is what helps one to further this path. It's not the entire path, but it's a big component of the path that helps to develop this penetrative wisdom. So that's the one thing that the Buddha talks about to really develop and focus a lot of time on, but there's a lot of other things too. Monks, they do not partake of the deathless, who do not partake of mindfulness directed to the body. So what he's saying is, if you don't practice breathing mindfulness meditation, there's no way you're going to get to enlightenment. There's no way for you to attain this deathless state, this enlightened mental state where you're not going to be reborn again and be brought back into this world if you don't practice breathing mindfulness meditation. So if you don't partake in breathing mindfulness meditation, you're not going to get this deathless or this enlightened mental state. They partake of the deathless who partake of who there might be some, hold on. They partake of the deathless who partake of I think I must have done a typo here, mindfulness directed to the body. So this one he's saying, okay, if you practice mindfulness directed at the body, then you will attain enlightenment. You will attain this deathless mental state, right? This enlightened mental state. Monks, the deathless has not been partaken of by those who have not partaken of mindfulness directed at the body. So those who don't practice breathing mindfulness meditation are not going to attain enlightenment. The deathless has been partaken of by those who have partaken of mindfulness directed at the body. So basically, two sets of sentences that are essentially saying the same thing. Those who meditate and do breathing mindfulness meditation, they're going to attain enlightenment and leads to enlightenment. Those who don't, they're not going to be able to get to this enlightened mental state. So remember that this book, Ānāpānasati, is all about the importance and the teachings of breathing mindfulness meditation and helping you to see how important it is, that there's just no way you can get to enlightenment without developing breathing mindfulness meditation. Now, what do we say down here? Monks, they have fallen away from the deathless, who have fallen away from breathing, from mindfulness directed at the body. Okay, same thing, just saying it again. They have not fallen away from the deathless, who have not fallen away from mindfulness directed at the body. So he's just repeating the same thing over and over. So now I think, Nick, that you know what the deathless is, that it's enlightenment, you can probably read through this and figure it out. That, monks that have neglected, mindfulness of breathing, then they're going to not attain enlightenment. Those that are undertaking it will attain it. Those who are heedless, right? He's just going through those that have forgotten, right? They're not going to attain it. Let's see. They have not pursued breathing mindfulness meditation. They're not going to pursue and attain enlightenment. They have not developed breathing mindfulness meditation, and they're not going to develop enlightenment. Those who have not cultivated breathing mindfulness meditation are not going to cultivate this enlightened mental state. He's just using different words to keep saying the same thing over and over, just to make sure it's really ingrained in the mind. This is part of the teaching, is like repetition, because remember, everything's oral. Nobody's writing everything down. So repetition, repetition, repetition. You see this throughout the Buddhist teachings, where he's just repeating the same thing over and over again, sometimes just changing one or two words in a sentence. They have not fully understood the deathless, this enlightened mental state. Those who have not fully understood mindfulness of breathing. They have fully understood this enlightened mental state. Those who have fully understood breathing mindfulness meditation. They have not realized, this is the last one, right? Realization of enlightenment is not going to be realized by those who do not realize mindfulness directed to the body. They have not realized the deathless who, or they have realized the deathless who have realized mindfulness directed to the body. So not just breathing mindfulness meditation, but specifically that first foundation of mindfulness, because it's the body, the feelings, the mind, and the mental objects. If all you ever had was awareness of the mental objects, then you haven't fully developed awareness of mind and mindfulness yet. If all you understand is the condition of the mind, that you've been angry for 2 weeks, you haven't fully developed awareness or mindfulness yet. If all you ever do is you have awareness once the mind's angry and you have feelings of anger in the mind, you wouldn't be able to attain enlightenment. In order to obliterate this discontentedness, you have to get all the way to the point where you can sense the bodily sensations before it ever pollutes the mind. So you can slap that lid on the bucket and not allow the poison to get into the mind. That's how you obliterate discontentedness, because you have such awareness of these 4 foundations that you can notice an arising frustration or arising annoyance when it's just a bodily sensation and it hasn't even gotten to the mind yet. Because when you cut it off there more and more and more and more and more, eventually they won't even arise anymore. So he's specifically talking here about developing this mindfulness directed at the body, or that first foundation of mindfulness, the bodily sensations that arise prior to actually developing a feeling in the mind. And you've got to get to that point where you're starting to notice any kind of anger or frustration or guilt or shame or fear or boredom or loneliness or shyness, resentment, jealousy. You got to notice it when it's in the body before it even gets to the mind. And that's where you can obliterate this and get to the point where it doesn't even arise anymore.
Well, Nick says, it does make sense now. So thank you, teacher.
You're welcome.
Okay, for now, last question from Judith. She says, shall we try to be aware of the breath?
Your internet broke up a little bit. Did you say, should we be aware of the breath?
Yeah, exactly. She asked saying, shall we try to be aware of the breath at all times as we do things?
You don't have to have obsessive awareness of the breath at all times. You need to develop awareness of breath in meditation, because that's what you're focusing on, is the breath, is the present moment. And in daily life, wherever you need to kind of resync the mind and kind of have awareness of breath, sure. But to maintain awareness of the breath throughout your entire daily life, you wouldn't be able to focus on anything else, because the mind can only focus on one thing at a time. So you're not going to be able to focus on the breath all the time in your daily life. So focus on talking to mom, or focus on feeding your cat or feeding your dog, or focus on washing dishes, and you're focused on that. But if you notice a sensation arising in the body, or you notice some feeling starting to come into the mind, sure, you can pause the dishwashing for a second, close your eyes, breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. And then once you've kind of cut off that thought and you've obliterated at the stump, then go right back to washing your dishes again. Put it in the past. But to be able to maintain awareness of breath all the way through your day, it wouldn't be possible.
Okay, question from Facebook. Tina asks, saying, how we live life between self and non-self in our daily life?
How do we live life between self and non-self? Basically, the unenlightened mind is going to have a self there, right? The unenlightened mind, and until you get into that first stage of enlightenment, there's going to be a self there. The mind mistakenly believes that there is a self. It falsely identifies with the body and or the mind as being a self. But this is part of that ignorance, part of the delusion, part of the unknowing of true reality. And as long as that's there, the mind's going to be discontent. So you've got to eradicate it, where you train the mind to let go of it. And before the mind will be ready or willing to let go of the self, there's got to be a whole lot of other preparatory work on the Eightfold Path. You've got to learn the Three Universal Truths, the Four Noble Truths, the entire Eightfold Path. You got to be incorporating all of these teachings in daily life. You need to be practicing breathing mindfulness meditation, loving kindness meditation, all the other teachings, and start moving the mind through the jhanas. And once the mind starts getting into these four preliminary stages of the jhanas, that's the time to start focusing on eradicating the self, because the mind isn't going to be ready to do that early in practice. So you need to be working with a teacher very closely in order to develop the whole Eightfold Path as a life practice. And as you do that, and you develop this life practice more and more, then the mind will be ready to actually let go of the self. But it's not going to be ready or willing to do that until you've done all this other preparatory work. Once you eradicate the self, life becomes much more peaceful. People think that if you have this self-identity or this self-image, that somehow the mind needs that in order to function. But it doesn't. And you're actually going to be a whole lot more peaceful without it, because now if somebody looks at this body strange, or if somebody talks to this body or this mind, if the body is mocked or talked about in a negative or disparaging way, or anything that happens related to the self-image or self-identity, where in the past you might have gotten irritated or enraged or angry or frustrated or something else, or maybe even bored or lonely, like, oh, I wish I could do my hair a different way and look a different way, and I feel kind of bored with this hairstyle or with these clothes. When you eradicate the self, you're not going to deal with any of those discontent feelings associated with the self-image and self-identity. And that's part of the liberation of the mind. But there's got to be a lot of work ahead of time. I don't recognize your name. I'm not sure if you've been involved in the classes before, but I suggest you jump into this book, which should be linked wherever you're watching this at, and you can download this. And you're welcome to attend the group learning program, which is on Sunday and Wednesday. That is at the same time, 9 p.m. Thai time, where I walk you through the teachings of this, because this is the real preparatory work in order to get to the point where the mind's ready to let go of the self. And letting go of the self, it takes several months, maybe years, to really get to the point where the mind fully lets go of the self. So this path, it took the Buddha 6 years to attain enlightenment. Some people think he instantly attained enlightenment, but it's not true. It took him a 6-year pursuit. So it's going to take you some time to put all this together and slowly start eradicating the self once you get into the jhanas.
Thanks, teacher, for your help. No more questions for now.
Okay, so I will just thank you all for joining for today's class. This is the last class for this book because we went through the entire book between last week and this week. And now we're going to be moving into this next book, which is called The Foremost Householders. This book was just uploaded to our Facebook group and you can download it. This is all the most applicable teachings, the extract or the curated teachings related to household life. So here you're going to see the Buddha talking to husbands and wives and sons and daughters, people who are in the household life, where a lot of the teachings that we've learned before, which are still applicable to your life, he's talking to monks or ordained practitioners. Here he's talking to household people about teachings related to the household life. What's important as you read this is understand that anytime he's talking to a particular gender or a particular role, you can apply that to your life too. So if he's talking to a wife about how to be a good wife, but you're a man, you can apply that to being a good husband too. Or if he's talking to a husband, talking about how to be a good husband, you can apply that to being a wife too. He just didn't take the time to say, while he's talking to this one man, he didn't take the time to address all the different genders, or at least they didn't document it that way. They documented it in the teachings as him talking to this one person, and they captured husband or wife or son or daughter. So be sure that you widen your horizon and understand that he's teaching to all genders and all roles in the household life. Just because he happens to be talking to a husband or a wife, you can switch the gender, switch the role, and have it apply to your life as well. The other thing to keep in mind that I've mentioned before that you're going to start seeing in this book is you're going to start seeing him talk about the realms and talk about, okay, if you're this type of husband or this type of wife, you will be reborn in a good destination, a heavenly realm, or you do these type of things, you're going to be reborn into a lower realm. Remember that he never used the rebirth in these other realms as motivation or encouragement or fear or shame or guilt to motivate people to learn and practice his teachings. He's just telling people the truth. They asked him a question. Hey, how can I be a good husband? Well, here's how to be a good husband. And if you do these things, this is the results of being this type of person, practicing this good moral conduct or this mental discipline. So if you've got conditioning from other traditions where you've been guilted or shamed or feared into learning and practicing those teachings based on, going to hell or motivated by going to heaven or whatever, that's not what the Buddha's doing here. He's just teaching true reality and helping the people understand. And those teachings related to the various realms are part of the teachings because that's the way this whole cycle of rebirth works. That's the truth of the matter. And he's just delivering the truth. And he knows the truth. People asked him questions, so he's telling them the truth. And he only ever taught to people who asked him questions. He never barged into a house or he never barged into some group and said, now let me tell you how to attain enlightenment. He only showed up places where he was invited to go. And when he was invited to go somewhere, he would show up and he would teach based on the questions that people asked. In a lot of cases, he didn't even deliver a discourse. He was basically invited to a certain village or to a certain home. And when he arrived, they said, okay, Master Gotama, share with us about how to be a good wife or how to be a good husband. And he said, okay, that's what you want to learn? Here's the teaching. And that's what was captured. So he didn't have kind of like a predetermined thing that he was trying to force everybody to learn and practice what he taught. But instead, he had already attained enlightenment. His mind was already peaceful, calm, serene, and content with joy. And he was making himself available to anybody who chose to learn with him. And it wasn't until he was invited that he would actually then share the teachings with people based on their invitation and based on their question. He never used these truths and this wisdom about where you would be reborn in either an unfavorable destination or a favorable destination as a way to forcefully push somebody to learn and practice his teachings, because you can't force somebody to attain enlightenment. It's not possible. There's 1,000,001 decisions that someone has to make in order to attain enlightenment. Each time you meditate, each time you pick up a book, each time you cut off unwholesome thoughts and arise wholesome thoughts, each time you choose to learn and practice right speech, for example, all these various teachings, they have to be the choice of the individual. And there is no guilt, shame, or fear, because that's what the Buddha is trying to eliminate through his teachings. He's trying to help people learn how to eliminate these from the mind. So he never used those as a way to motivate people to practice his teachings, because his whole goal was to help people eliminate those discontent feelings from the mind. So just be aware of any conditioning that you might have from previous venues that you've learned in, that if you see this kind of language, it might kind of incite that conditioning that you've experienced in the past, and just know that that's not what the Buddha's doing at all. Do you guys have any questions on this book, or kind of like what we're going to be learning? Do you guys need to know what chapters we're going to actually be learning next week? I actually just pulled it up on my computer. It's chapters 1 through 20. That's next week. And then the following week is going to be chapter 21 through 41. Okay? So I pulled this up on the schedule that we have. And if you guys don't have the link for this, just let me know. Send me a private message, and I will send you the link where you can see the whole schedule of classes. But next week's going to be chapter 1 through 20. And that should take you about 45 minutes or an hour to read. But as I've always said, I suggest you just read like 10 minutes a day. And each day just read like 2 or 3 chapters. And then just sit with that and reflect on that for that day. And then the next day, read another 2 or 3 chapters. And then just sit with that and let that soak in. Because this material that the Buddha shares is quite dense, and you don't want to just plow through it and kind of forget it. You want to look at how to apply this to your life, really reflecting on what he shared and how to apply it in your daily life. So thank you guys for joining. Enjoy the reading of chapters 1 through 20, and next week we will explore those chapters, and I'll answer any questions you guys have. So until next Saturday, have a really wonderful rest of your day. And tomorrow in our group learning program, we're going to be doing the 3 Universal Truths and the 4 Noble Truths. Great refresher for those of you guys that have been in those talks before. You might want to come to those as well, because as you guys know, right view in the 3 Universal Truths and 4 Noble Truths are just so important to really soak into the mind. There's just no way that you could actually hear that enough. There's no such thing as learning the 4 Noble Truths too much. So I encourage you guys, if you're able, to either attend that class tomorrow or listen back to the playback. And then on Wednesday, we're going to be teaching chanting as a 4-part series, where we're going to be doing chanting for each individual class. So between either Sunday, Wednesday, or Saturday, I'll either see you in one of those classes or all of them. Have a really lovely day, and we'll see you next time. Sawadee Kap. Thank you again for watching. Enjoy your meditation. Look forward to seeing you online and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.